Today is November 7th, 2016. My name is John Dalton, and it is my privilege and honor to be interviewing Ron Friedman for the Archive of American Television and the Writers Guild Foundation here at the Writers Guild Foundation Library in Los Angeles, California.
That's good. I said nothing because I wanted you to have the complete spotlight for that.
Appreciate that. Now it's your turn.
Okay.
Okay. Mr. Freeman, we'd like to take a few minutes and get some background information.
Yeah, why don't you call me Ron?
Ron.
Yeah, my
Yes.
students call me Ron. I insist on that.
Perfect.
Mr. Friedman feels like my father, who would now be 209, so.
Well, that brings us to what was your name at birth, Ron?
Ronald Irwin Friedman. I was named for the British actor Ronald Colman.
Is that right?
Yes, as were a lot of little Jewish boys in those years. Luckily, my mom didn't watch Stephen Fetchit movies, or I'd have been Stephen Fetchit Friedman. But when you find out who that is, you'll see it's embarrassing.
I know who it is, and it would be embarrassing, and thank heaven for small favors. When were you born?
I was born August 1st, 1932, which was a very good year for short Jews. And I was born with whooping cough and not expected to live. I don't know how that worked out. I haven't paid much attention since then.
I think you're okay.
I think I am too.
Where were you born?
Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the McGee Hospital. My brother was born there, so were my children.
And
you get a discount if you...
Did you grow up there as well?
I did, but not right away, because my father had a men's clothing store in Weirton, West Virginia. And the joke about Weirton, West Virginia used to be if they give Pennsylvania an enema, they put the bone in Weirton. And it's accurate, Weirton was in the panhandle of the state of West Virginia. And the town was a steel mill town, one of those that did not unionize during the years in which unions became okay. They didn't unionize because the Weir steel was run by Nazi sympathizers. And I had the pleasure when I got older of seeing mill police beat union organizers on the street. You don't forget that. That's why I like the Guild. I'm all for unions. I know how tough it was to make them happen. At any rate, Weirton was the town, and it was a highly anti-Semitic town because there were a lot of Eastern Europeans that worked in the mill, and the local Catholic Church was Our Lady of the Spanish Inquisition, which was dedicated to making sure nobody forgot anything from the 15th and 16th centuries. And unfortunately, before I began the first grade, the elementary school, which had burned, was being remodeled, so I had to go to a Catholic parochial school. And my parents took me to the rabbi. He said, you will worship as they worship, you will do as they do, except when it comes time to mention their God. You will instead not say his name, but insert the word, ha. Everything worked out until Christmas, and we're singing Christmas carols. And my teacher, Sister Mary Jewhater, was walking up and down the aisles with what looked like a baseball club bat. And we're singing, Christ is born in Bethlehem. I sang, Ha is born, and she whacked me, and I said, Jesus Christ. And she said, sing it, you boy. And I've had this deep connection with the faith ever since.
Can I ask, what was your father's name?
Louis Friedman. And he had been a shirt maker in Poland, escaped Poland to England and became a shirt maker and men's clothing maker, and then ended up in Weirton with a men's clothing store. And my father spoke just about every language known in Europe. And people would say from the mill, if somebody came in from Belarusia or someplace, they'd say, take him to Louis, he can talk to him. And he could, miraculously. I know he spoke Turkish, Russian, Greek, French, Italian, Polish, Ukrainian, Slovenian. I mean, everybody talked to Louis.
What was your mom's name?
Her name was Minna. She was born Minnie, but she hated that. It didn't sound classy enough. And my mother was classy. She was a concert pianist and an opera singer. And when, of course, my father died, she's a woman alone with 2 sons. So what does a concert pianist and an opera singer do? She became a piano teacher. But she was a gutsy, fearless character. And I became a feminist when I saw how badly my mom was treated when my dad died. But she was tough.
What other traits do you think you inherited from both of them?
Musicality and the love of the stage, and also writing.
Were they funny?
They were funny. They were funny. Believe me, sometimes funny is confused with crazy, but that's okay. Crazy is stimulating.
What were some of your interests when you were growing up?
I was very interested in science, and one of my favorite acquisitions from on the boardwalk in Atlantic City was a rock mineral set made in Japan that had minute samples of just about every mineral or rock that you could imagine. I loved that. And of course, I loved dinosaurs and all of my relatives who didn't look like dinosaurs. It was okay.
Did you do any writing early on?
I did, and I won prizes for writing when I was in 1st grade. And I always won prizes for writing, and I loved to do it. And I really thought seriously of becoming a writer. But because my father died when I was 11 and my brother was 9.5, and my mother was a piano teacher, we moved to Pittsburgh to be with her family. Times were very tough, and money was tough. And dinner was often a can of bumblebee salmon that my brother and I split. So when my mother said, you need something to fall back on, I thought, yep. And that's why I became an architect. I had a lot of college scholarships. I was lucky. I couldn't afford to take the ones in the Ivy League because I couldn't afford to leave town, which was then Pittsburgh. But architecture, I read The Fountainhead, and I figured, I'm going to get laid. Unfortunately, the only woman I met there the first year was Andy Warhol's mother. She was the cleaning lady.
Wow.
She looked just like Andy did with the wig, the same thing.
Just going back for a second,
Yeah.
what kinds of things did you write as a little kid? Was it comedy or?
Well, I wrote a lot of everything, and one of the first things I wrote in the 1st grade was about a bad dream I had from eating cheesecake. And the whole class loved it, and I was sent around to every room in the school to read my little story. It was addictive.
So you got accolades from that, and you
Always.
enjoyed the, yeah.
Yep.
Did you listen to the radio when you were growing up?
Constantly.
What were some of your favorites?
Jack Benny, The Shadow, Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy, Superman. Let's see what else was on. The Green Hornet, which was pretty crappy. Sergeant Preston of the Yukon. And Fred Allen.
Could you make that distinction as a little kid, what was well written and what wasn't as good?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You bet. I couldn't stand Bob Hope because it was just joke, 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 and sometimes the jokes didn't work. I later worked for Bob Hope, and he loved me, and he made me an enormous offer, a lot of money. But the deal was I had to go to Vietnam for his Christmas show. I said, Bob, I support my mother in Pittsburgh, I support my ex-wife, I support myself and my wife, I support my in-laws in Palm Springs, I support my kids who are going into college. I said, what happens if I get killed? He said, well, then your worries are over.
Good point.
But I chose not to go.
Do you remember the first time you saw television?
Yes. It was in the window of Ratner's hardware store on Murray Avenue while waiting for a streetcar. And the Sid Caesar show was on.
Wow.
And I recognized him because I had seen a bit of it at another friend's house who had a television set, which was a big deal. But there's something you don't know and most people who are not close to my age don't understand. Television was available in 1933. It was a big feature of the 1939 New York World's Fair. The war interrupted the development of television. But I'll never forget a Pete Smith special at the movies, one of the many things they threw in between the features and a double feature, and that was about television coming in the future. This was like 1937 or 38. And it showed a very wealthy Park Avenue home, everybody in formal attire, and the butlers there handing out drinks. As on the television, a newscaster appears and he said, we've just been able to identify the murderer who's been stalking the streets of New York. And it was the butler who's serving the drinks. The power of the media.
Did you attend the 1939 World's Fair?
No, I wanted to go. I really wanted to go because I wanted to see Meccano, the Mechanical Man. and I wanted to go to all the exhibits and the rides. And I told my father, I want to go, and he said, you're a pisher, you'll go when you're big. Well, I didn't make it, but I did write a book about it called Fair Game 39, about a plot, the Nazi plot to invade Poland. And the secret of that is leaked to a WPA artist who is now pursued by Nazis and by communists to kill him before he reveals that plan. And they chase him through the New York World's Fair of 1939. Many offers, several options yet to be published. Listeners, pay attention, it's not too late.
So you mentioned your architectural career.
Yes.
How long were you an architect?
5 years in school, almost 7 years in practice. And I was successful. I was the lead designer and field supervisor for a medium-sized Pittsburgh firm, 10 to 100 draftsmen, depending on the size of the deal. I also had my own practice, and I was doing GSA work, which was lucrative but shitty. Post offices, and they tell you which crappy colors to use that wouldn't excite violence on the premises. And I couldn't clear 10 grand. And I had 2 brilliant kids, and I thought, I'm not going to be able to get them educated. So I thought, why not go to write comedy? And Shelley Berman, who was then one of the most hot comics ever, was passing through Pittsburgh. I'd met him in summer stock because some summer stock I worked as a singer, actor, scene designer. I convinced him he remembered me, and he said, you can't write for me. And I said, give me your address, let me try. So he did, and I wrote something. 6 weeks later, he said, schmuck, come to New York, you can do this. Not for me, nobody can do it for me, but come to New York, I'll get you an agent. I'm at the Perry Como show. So I flew to New York, and the World Series was taking place, Pittsburgh Pirates, New York Yankees, 1960. And I flew to New York to the Perry Como show, and I come into the Como show, and Sally says, I'm having a nervous breakdown, I'm going to Jamaica, I can't talk to you. I said, I came in all the way from Pittsburgh. He said, it'll be there when you return. Luckily, the scene designer for the Como show was my fraternity brother, Gary Smith, later of Smith Hemian. He said, did you bring material? I said, yeah. He says, give it to me, I'll give it to the head writer. The head writer was a legendary radio writer, television writer named Goodman Ace. So while I sat there, he read my material. And he called me to the writer's room, and he said, if any of these Jews die, I'll give you a job. He said, but I have nothing in the budget. I'll take you to William Morris, they'll sign you. So they did.
You must have had a lot of confidence in your ability to write to leave your successful architecture.
Let's say that my mother always said to my brother, I would have, if I'd only taken that Metropolitan Opera job, if I'd only followed Max Reinhardt with The Miracle into New York. So my brother and I made a deal. We're never going to say woulda, shoulda, coulda. So I figured if I'm going to go for it, I'm going to go for it. And I did. Terrified, absolutely terrified, because I was basically a shy guy. Now, of course, that's ludicrous.
I
can't be a shy guy in show business, particularly not writing stand-up or doing it. Anyway.
How did you come to get hooked up with Von Meter?
Well, I'd been writing in New York, and very successfully, for a bunch of comics who played toilets. Toilet is a term of art. That's where mafia guys sit at the front row with hookers, and if you're not funny, they throw ashtrays at you. And it's the kind of place where the men's room attendant quits because he can't stand the smell from the kitchen. So this is a term of art, toilets. And also the big clubs, so I was used to doing it. And when I first would write something, they would say it's not funny. I'd say it's funny. They'd say, you do it. So I would do it. I'd get laughs, and they'd pay me. And along the way, I did some comedy albums, one for the Smothers Brothers, and I forget, it's all mushed together now, and wrote acts that were successful for some name brand comics of the era, many now dead by popular demand. And Von Meter heard about me, and the guy who had produced one of his acts, a guy named Mickey Ross, later of Ross and West, who produced All in the Family, and created the John Nickel Scholarship Fund, invited me to work on an album for Vaughn called Have Some Nuts, in which he played a little bit of Kennedy because he was John Fitzgerald Kennedy, as far as anybody knew. Anyway, I'm sitting with him working on a new act when Kennedy was assassinated. And Vaughn, eloquent as always, says, oh, fuck, what do I do now? And I said, well, wait 6 months and I'll write you a new act. And I did. And because Kennedy had been so beloved, and because the album First Family Rides had been so beloved, everybody showed up at the Blue Angel for Vaughn's return to the stage of comedy. Every media personality was there. Every magazine, every newspaper, every television outlet. The place was jammed to see what he would do. And Shelley Berman showed up in a tuxedo to introduce him and take credit for me being his writer. And anyway, the act went over very well, but all the reviews summarized the same thing. Vaughn Meader is an indifferent performer, but the material was brilliant. And luckily, Danny Kaye and his producers saw the material and took me to Los Angeles, where I didn't want to go. Because I'd been here before. Los Angeles was like Peoria in 1948, before they got electrified. The biggest dress shop on Rodeo Drive was Walter Clark's. They sold moo-moos. There was no restaurant open later than 10, except Wally Hammond's. Ollie Hammond's, that was it. Anyway.
So LA just wasn't as exciting as you would have wanted at the time?
No, because I was in New York. New York was and is exciting. I love New York, and if you can make it there, and I did, you can make it anywhere, and obviously I did, or I wouldn't be here.
Talk about meeting Danny Kaye.
Well, because I had worked with Frank Lloyd Wright at Taliesin West briefly, and Perry Lafferty, the producer of the show, knew that story, he insisted that I tell the story. And I did, and Danny was fascinated. So he liked the fact that I'd worked for a big-name, crazy architect. So he treated me very nicely indeed, which was unusual. As Harvey Korman said when asked about Danny Kaye, he said he does a great impression of a human being. But his impression worked for me, and I always was crazy about him.
How would you describe his style and kind of what he did?
A kind of refined Robin Williams with an insane desire to replace Fred Astaire. Because he was really stream of consciousness whenever he felt like it. And also he could sing, he could dance, he could do incredible vocal pyrotechnics, which were very big in the Yiddish theater. All that crap. Very much part of Yiddish theater. And he did it brilliantly. His show-stopping number in Lady in the Dark was called Tchaikovsky. And it was a collection of all the Russian composers, which he delivered in something like, it seemed like 20 seconds, but brilliant. So he was brilliant. He was also a licensed pilot who could fly anything. Anything from big passenger jets to a helicopter, anything at all. He was a master Chinese chef. He apprenticed in the kitchen of a San Francisco restaurant, learning to disjoint chickens with 2 hatchets. And he was also a cordon bleu chef. And every year he'd have a big Mandarin dinner that he would make for all the writers. Extraordinary guy.
What kind of material did you write for the show? Was it sketches or monologues?
Monologues, whatever was called for. And luckily my background in summer stock and as an actor and writing for stand-ups came in handy immediately, because one of the first shows featured a sketch of him as the world's oldest living barristers. And he was so old, and he had this big handkerchief, and he'd gesture with it, and the weight of the handkerchief would almost pull him over. Anyway, they did the dress, and it wasn't getting laughs. We had a big meeting afterwards. Why wasn't it getting laughs? And I said, he doesn't have his handkerchief. Everybody looked at me, so what? I said, the handkerchief is the prop that gives him the character. And Danny was listening. He said, that's fucking right. Get me the fucking handkerchief. So I remember that.
Do you remember, was there sort of a writer's room on that show?
Absolutely.
Can you describe what that was like and who was there? And
Mel Tolkien was there, a brilliant guy, brilliant pianist, great mind, been one of Sid Caesar's original writers. Huge man out of Russia, still spoke with a Russian accent. Shelley Keller, great guy, a different kind of sense of humor from Mel's, who was more literate, and Ernie Chambers, and trying to remember the other guys. Oh, Paul Mazursky, later to find distinction as a writer-director. And Larry Tucker, who was then Paul's partner. It was a gifted, crazy bunch. And we did 39 shows a year then. So to do 39 shows, it was, let's say, an interesting view of people working under duress.
Do you recall any of the guest stars? There were people like Mary Tyler Moore and Art Carney and Vincent Price and Tim. Any stories?
Vincent Price later became a friend. He was a great guy. And in fact, when I produced, I would often hold Vincent up to actors who were après-moi le déluge divas. And I would say, how long do you want to keep working in this business? Why? I said, well, the minute I fire you from here, you're never going to work again because everybody knows what an asshole you are. Well, I said, you're going to get older. And then who's going to want to hire you? I said, why do you think Vincent Price works? He treats everyone like they matter. He treats everyone like they are somebody worth his time and attention. So when it's time to hire an old guy, they don't hire A, B, C, or D. They hire Vincent because they know he'll give a great performance and they know everybody will love him and it'll be an experience. So anyway, he was a great guy, and because my wife and I are painters, we hit it off because he was a great art collector.
Oh, very good advice you have there.
Donna Valerie was a guest, and of course, God, she was the star of, not Gypsy, great dance. Gwen Verdon was a guest. Harry Belafonte was a guest.
Liberace I have here.
Yes, he was a guest.
Yeah.
Yes,
and Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong.
Absolutely. Louis.
Quite a roster of.
It was because most variety shows would not put black entertainers on. And in fact, Danny's band leader, Paul Weston, and Danny wanted a band of many races. So Red Callender was on bass, Buddy Collette was on the flute and on the clarinet, and Clark Terry was on the trumpet. So it was black and white. And we had black guests and got a lot of flack from the southern stations in the CBS group.
And how did Danny Kaye react to that? Do you
ignored it?
So he may have, as Harvey Korman said, been difficult to work with, but ultimately it seems like he was a good guy.
The guy had guts, and he also knew what was right, and he was willing to stand up for it, as he was with the House Un-American Activities Committee. Because Danny was there, along with Bogart and Bacall, and along with a lot of other celebrities who were later told, don't stand up to be counted anymore, your careers are over. But Danny was there.
Since, we're with the Television Academy, we want to ask you, do you remember being nominated for an Emmy for the Danny Kaye Show?
Absolutely.
Do you remember that evening and what it meant to you? And
yeah, it was terrific because it was far more meaningful than it is now. Oddly, now there are so many awards. I mean, it feels like the kind of millennial students' upbringing, where if you're on a baseball team, if you can hold the ball without falling on your head, you get a cup. If you can hold the ball and throw it and maybe get it to the next guy, you get a statue. If you can hold it and throw it and maybe hit it, you get an evening. So then it was really meaningful because it stood alone.
Why did you leave the show?
Ambition. I was writing a lot of the main sketches and monologues constantly. So I went in for a raise. And I was told, we can't give you a raise. There are 7 other writers. If we give you a raise, we're going to have to give them a raise. But I was stupid. I stuck it out, and then I thought, well, I need to write a book, so I'll write a book when I'm not there on the show. But after that, I learned the old adage, when you have a job, never leave it. Wait until it ends.
How did you meet up with or start working with Pat McCormick?
Pat McCormick I knew in New York. People put us together because they thought we were funny, equally insane. In fact, they used to call me Crazy Ron Friedman, which pissed me off because I'm not. But if you're paying me to be crazy, I can be fucking crazy. So anyway, I met Pat and had the pleasure of being there when his son Ben was born, and people are gathered around, and Pat brings out a covered dish, and people say, where's your baby? And he pulled the cover up, and there's the baby surrounded by new potatoes and parsley. That was Pat. We really hit it off. We did a lot of work together, and Pat would do things that would embarrass a public toilet seat in downtown Manila during a beer drinking competition. One of his favorites was walking with me in London, New York, seeing a pretty girl and saying, "Below me," and then grabbing you and saying, "How dare you offend this young woman? I'm sorry, he's an ugly American. I'm really pushing me." And he was 6'8", so obviously it was a funny sight. In fact, talking about Pat, we're doing the Lucy in London show, and I have ceased to go out in public with him after an episode at the Cheshire Cheese, which is an ancient restaurant on the Strand. I guess that's where it is, the newspaper row, and everybody sits at long refectory tables. So I went there with him, and it's a convocation of university professors all over the world. So I said, "I'm leaving. I'm not going to sit with you with this gathering." He says, "I'm a Harvard man. I know how to behave." As he sits down, he cuts a fart that rattled the pewter plates on the shelves. And everyone looks around, and he shoves me and he says, "How dare you? These learned people from all over the academic world, they're here, and you disgrace. You're really beyond belief." And I didn't know whether to kill him, so I sat again, and once more he cuts it, even more loudly. And now, in many languages, l'addition, il conto, everybody's paying up to leave. And as they go, he stands up, he says, "Well, if you can do it, I can too." And he sticks his ass out and cuts another triple flutter blast. You had to be there. I didn't have to be there. So when he said, "Let's go to Westminster Abbey," I said, "Never." He said, "I'm a Catholic. I respect any place where Jesus is attached to the management. It'll be okay." And I should preface this. Pat had a hobby at the time, putting rolls of quarters in his pants so he could drop them like that. The weight of the quarters dropped them down. He would do that at the corner of 57th Street and 5th Avenue every day at noon for weeks. And people would come up to photograph him doing that. Anyway, I was worried going into Westminster Abbey. And we're there, and suddenly, bang, his pants drop. And he's there with the shittiest looking underwear you've ever seen. And a guard comes up to him and says, "Not in Poets' Corner, sir." And Pat said, "Is this Poets' Corner?" He said, "Yes." Pat recites, "There once was a man from Nantucket." I was evicted from Westminster Abbey with Pat McCormick.
How long did your association with him last?
Until I got tired of covering for him, because we would have jobs and Pat would vanish to do other jobs. One time he vanished with the Carol Wayne, who played the weather girl when Johnny Carson did his Floyd Turbo and various other bits. He was taking a round the world tour with her, and they were in Kuwait, and he sold her to a sheikh. He made the offer. The sheikh made the offer. The sheikh's representative made the offer, and Pat said, "I want 40,000 camels. I want 25 horses, good score horses, and I want winners. I don't want losers." And, he asked for a couple other things and dates, my weight and dates every 6 months. The guy comes back with the deal, and he wanted to claim her. Pat had to call the American embassy to get somebody to undo the deal. So I'd be working on a project we had together, and he'd say, "I'm stuck in Kuwait." Something about the government and Carol, because she's got such huge knockers. So I got tired of covering for him.
There's only so long you can deal with that.
Yeah, but I loved him. We did great stuff together. We did a pilot for Stiller and Meara. They were Ben Stiller's parents. And it was funny. It was called Candlelight and Wieners. Pat and I are called in. They're building the sets. Pat and I are called in to the head of the CBS network, and he said, "We're not going to do the show." I said, "Why not?" And he said, "Jerry Stiller has no neck. We can't put anybody with no neck on CBS television." And Pat said, "Oh, that's good. I thought you were going to give us some dumb, shitty reason."
Perfect.
Anyway.
Tell us a little bit about your association with Jonathan Winters.
Oh, Johnny and I hit it off immediately. And I used to wing it with him. He enjoyed that. and I would set him up and just turn him loose. And we had great times because we could read each other's minds. And if you know Johnny, one of his famous characters was Maud Frickert, the horny old lady. And after I'd been working with her for a couple of years, I said, "Where did you get Maudie?" And he looks around like he's taking out plans to the vault, and he takes out a yellow newspaper clipping that shows an old woman in a wheelchair, and behind her is standing a retarded kid. And the headline was, "Newsboy Mary's Best Customer." And he said, I looked at it and I could hear her say, "Show it to me, Lenny." "Oh, no, don't show me all of it now. Wait for the honeymoon." Oh, that's good. Oh. Anyway.
He's so known for improvisation. How did you write for him? Did he ever say anything that you actually wrote?
Absolutely. Everything when we did sketches, but he was free to improvise. But I always gave him opportunities to wing it because I knew where he would.
So you would write in chances for him to do his own stuff?
Oh, yeah, but we talk about it beforehand. So it was pretty much controlled, and he loved doing that when he could roam free. He was a great guy. I really loved him. We had great times together. And he told me wonderful stories about, he was working at the Hungry Eye in San Francisco, and he was doing so well that when he finished the midnight show, he didn't want it to stop. So he invited the audience to the Buena Vista for Irish coffee. And he took the whole audience for Irish coffee. And then he took them with him as he walked through town, entertaining them till 4 or 5 in the morning when he climbed the mast of the Balclutha. That's a sailing ship anchored in San Francisco Bay. He was doing Charles Lawton as Captain Bligh from Mutiny on the Bounty when, as he said, the men in the white coats came for him and taught him how to make rope-soled shoes for several months. And I asked him what happened. He said, "I didn't want to quit because I was afraid if I went to sleep, when I got up, my joker would be broken." And this is common with comics. When they get on a roll, don't want to stop, wake up, the joker is broken.
He's a special performer.
You bet.
One theme that keeps coming up in your career as we discuss it is you're constantly pivoting and doing new things. How did you make the transition from writing variety and monologues and sketches to starting to write sitcoms?
You know, desperation is a marvelous, marvelous goad to accomplishment. And what happens in show business, and it still does, is called stereotyping, pigeonholing. If you're successful playing an axe murderer, you will always be asked to be the axe murderer. I was wildly successful writing stand-up and writing comedy albums and writing for variety shows. But when variety started to dry up, I wanted to naturally progress to writing for half hours. And there was like an invisible wall of, well, you don't write that. That's not what you do. So I had to convince people I was capable of doing that. And when I wanted to transition into doing hours as well, or movies for television, I again had to convince people I could do it. One of the ways I did it, transitioning from comedy into writing hours and movies of the week, was I made a point of not being funny in meetings. It was a real effort, but I was not funny. And a couple times when we got along and the project was moving and everything was okay, the producer would say something, "You know, you're very funny. Have you thought of comedy?" And then I'd do 10 minutes, beginning with the words, "Well, look at it this way, asshole. I've been concealing my true identity. I'm actually the rightful king of France. There's the Scarlet Pimpernel in my mother's ass will convince you."
Well, is there sort of a learning curve, for example, going from variety to sitcom? Do you have to learn how to write a sitcom, or do you just take a script and use that and fill in the form?
The things that people who pay writers love to say are, "It writes itself," or "This shouldn't take any time at all," or "This is what I want," not recognizing the fact that those declarations don't deliver the finished product. And there is skill required to plot and to create characters and to create jokes that seem to come from character and don't feel like a joke. A joke is a stand-up routine, unless the comic is somebody who uses anecdotal storytelling or is somebody who plays an attitude, like Lewis Black. It's all a load of shit. Red, white, and shit. That's what it is. That's attitude. So if he says anything, he could give you directions for making a cherry tart, and it would be hilarious because he'd be vindictive and full of hate through it. Fucking cherries! You gotta pick cherries! Why cherries? Because they're red? We hate Indians, and we're picking cherries. You get the idea. But to convert all of this madness and this insanity, to channel it and determine what happens when, what is the sequence of events, how do you educate, literally educate a reader, an audience, so that they can process the story as it develops, and they have what they need to have learned to understand why a character is doing this. So you can deliver the motivation and deliver it on time and deliver it on budget. And television is a great taskmaster because there's no waffling. You must get to it quickly, or whoever's watching will go have 6 beers and never come back, or they'll just switch the channels. So it's a discipline, but I come out of architecture and civil engineering. I know from discipline. I was an actor, I know from discipline. I had children, I know from discipline. And the thing is, you need to focus that and learn to do it. But I'm a very quick study. I was always a fast architect. They used to call me Flash Friedman as an architect because I could do a particular jewelry store, and one of my firms did a lot of them. I could do the whole remodeling of a building, the signs, everything, the electrical, the showcases. I could do that in a day. And it was good. So I learned to write. I wrote fast. I'm not selling myself to anybody who's listening who actually has a job. I'm available.
In those days, how did you get assignments? Did you have an agent, or?
I had an agent who ceased to matter once I became hot. Then I had a lot of people who wanted to be my agent or my manager. And like a schmuck, I didn't accept them. One of them was Jack Rollins, Woody Allen's manager. He wanted to manage me, but I was arrogant. I'm not so arrogant now because I'm not fresh off the boat. I'm not fresh off anything. I am in my very late 30s, but I'm getting over it.
Well, you look like
extremely
you're
late
close
30s.
to that, actually.
Yes.
You wrote so many half-hour episodic shows.
Boy, did I.
In the 60s.
70s more.
And 70s, including, Get Smart, and we talked a little bit about my favorite episode of Gilligan's Island that you wrote, where Marianne thinks she's ginger. You mentioned that you actually got to go on the set of Bewitched. William Asher would have you. Do you remember anything about that experience?
Because Bill Asher liked me, loved me, and I loved Bill. I mean, Bill was one of those people, and there are a number of them in the business, who you would meet him, and he's just kind of unprepossessing, just a nice guy, and he doesn't make pronouncements, but he was a real artist. He really understood what it takes to sell what's on that screen. And that's what all the old-timers, all the big pros, all the greats I worked with, and I worked with a number of them, they all have the same thing. How do we sell this? Because they recognize this isn't real. We have to sell this so that the audience can live it. How do we do that? How do we make it real? What can we do through our art, our craft, our skill? That was Bill. He had a really strong instinct for what would play as real. And doing a fantasy like Bewitched, that was very important. So I was on his sets, I was on Gary Marshall's sets because I wanted to direct and Gary wanted me to. So I was on the Odd Couple set frequently and on Love American Style set. And I never really directed because I was too busy writing and making terrific money. And I had a lot of people support, as I explained. But I liked being on the Odd Couple set because first I knew Jack Klugman, because he was a graduate of my alma mater, Carnegie Tech, now Carnegie Mellon. And Jack Klugman was a great actor, just terrific. And he was a good guy until he did Quincy, and then he became a dramatic actor, and he was not accessible. But anyway, the head of the drama department in those years at Carnegie Tech was a very elegant guy who would make Noel Coward look low class, named Henry Betcher, a very elegant, refined guy. And when I was working with Jack on The Odd Couple, I said, I got to ask you, how did you get into the drama department? Who did you read for? He said, I read for Henry Betcher. I said, you're kidding me. He said, no, let me tell you my story. He says, I was a waiter at Bookbinders in Philadelphia, and I got into the Shies for 5 large. The Shylocks, he was a horse player. He owed them $5 grand. He said, this guy comes in and he says, Klugman, I'm going to break off your legs and shove them up your ass one at a time unless you come in with the 5 and the vigorish by Saturday. He said, that didn't seem like a career move. So I thought, I'll be an actor. So I went to Carnegie Tech and I signed up and I read for him. I said, what did he say? He said, you're not an actor, you're a truck driver. But there's a war on and we need men, you're in.
Talk about working with Gary Marshall.
Gary was great fun. And he was another artist. And he's not considered an artist because he made it look easy. And he made it look, the Yiddish word is hamish, like something you do in a homey fashion. It's just people hanging out together. And he would always say, just make it nice. Make it nice. And he did. But he had a real eye for talent, and he knew good dialogue. And he loved what I did on The Odd Couple, so I did some of the best ones. I really know they were, and I took great pride in it. And I knew from opera, my mother was an opera singer. Randall was an opera buff, big opera buff. I said, how about an episode with you and opera? Well, that's not going to be possible. I said, I'll do it. So I did. It's called Does Your Mother Know You're Out in Rigoletto? I'm proud of that because not everybody can get an opera singer on a half-hour sitcom. But
did you work with Randall and Klugman on the scripts? I mean, how much input or approval did they have over what you wrote?
I got to say, they had approval. They wouldn't do it if they didn't like it. But the first script I wrote was a Christmas show, and they had nothing to shoot. And Jerry Davis, a great guy, was the producer, and I'd worked for him before, and he called me and he said, we need something immediately for Christmas. So I said, how about this? Scrooge gets an Oscar. Felix has a little theater group. They're going to do a Christmas Carol, and Scrooge will be, but he refuses to be, and then he has a dream, and it's like he said, do that. So I did that, and both Klugman and Randall came up to me and quoted some lines. I said, I love that line. I love that line. Randall's line he loved was that he's the ghost of Jacob Marley, and he said, you're the ghost of Jacob Marley? I don't even know Jacob Marley. Do you have strange powers? He said, take a card, any card. Anyway, I enjoyed what I did, obviously. I still enjoy it. Memorable people. Gary was great.
Talk a little bit about Lucy in London. How did you come to write for that one?
Well, Lucy's husband, Gary Morton, whose real name was Morty Golddapper, I knew all the comics and I knew their real names. Jan Murray was Murray Janowski. Red Buttons was, I forget, Schwast, something Seymour Schwast, whatever it was. I knew all their names. So I knew her husband, and she knew my work. And she knew Pat McCormick. And she asked me, is he going to behave himself if you write something for me? I said, absolutely not. She said, well, I depend on you not to let him embarrass me. I said, he won't. So we wrote Lucy in London, and we got Tony Newley, who was great fun to work with, James Robertson Justice, who was Prince Charles, a mentor. Mentor meaning he took him to Paris to get laid in a whorehouse. He was great. Anyway, I'm diverging when I should be verging. So anyway, Lucy, I loved Lucy and she liked me. I'd met her on the Danny Kaye show, and we hit it off, just talking on the sidelines. Who knows why these things happen? But they did, and she was great fun. And I had one of the things, Pat McCormick and Lucy and I are sitting in her living room with her sister, really her cousin Cleo Smith, talking about Lucy in London, and Pat reaches into a bowl and starts eating, and he goes, hey, Lucy, these peanuts, they're shit. She said, those aren't peanuts, you idiot. Those are 18th century porcelain small shoes. You just chewed up about $4,000 worth.
So she was easy to work with? You got along?
She was great. Lucy was never finished, just like Fred Astaire. Can we make it better? Can we do this? How do we sell this? Is this right? We'll do it again. But we got along great.
Another show you worked on or wrote an episode or a couple for was The Partridge Family.
Yes.
Did your musical background help you at all with that, or did that not play
a little
into
bit,
it?
But Bernard Slade, who created it and also created The Flying Nun and Love on a Rooftop and a bunch of other things that were highly successful, always hired me. I knew Bern. We met at the Chateau Marmont when the Danny Kaye show brought me out. He was there with his family at the time. And we stayed friends, and anytime he had a show, I'd write several episodes.
There was a series, Funny Face, with Sandy Duncan.
That was Very unusual.
Yeah, and you were credited as story editor. Could you tell us a little bit about what a story editor does?
Well, what a story editor does depends on the culture, which is the new word to describe dysfunctional families, of the culture of a particular show. Sometimes a story editor just keeps the animals happy and makes sure that the writers get the scripts in. Sometimes the head writer makes sure that all the writers deliver the material on time and that it can be used, and if a script has to be eaten, rewrites it or sees that it's rewritten so it doesn't have to be eaten. But what happened on that show was that Sandy Duncan was ill. There was something going on with her, so she was bumping into walls and talking to trees, and Paramount didn't like her doctor's analysis, which was that she might have had a tumor behind her eye, which called for surgery. They didn't want to stop filming to have surgery, any more than they wanted to stop filming Chico and the Man to get him off cocaine. So the guy who created the show was no longer in good graces with the network or with Sandy, and so Jerry Davis, who was there as the producer, called me in to take over. And the problems were enormous because Sandy, it turns out, did have a tumor behind her eye, and when she was being treated with steroids. Steroids function by spreading out the contagion. Well, if it's a tumor, it will also make it grow faster. So she had difficulty walking and talking, much less doing business and doing stuff, doing her lines. So it was very difficult, very difficult. And finally, they shut the show down. She had surgery. The surgeon removed her eye, put in an artificial eye, and she married him, which is the least you can do if somebody takes your eye.
When she returned, they revamped it. Were you part of the revamping?
No.
Or? Okay.
No, because I was part of the bad history.
Right.
Show business does not like bad history. You never want to become part of it.
Right.
When you do, you are bad history.
What about any memories of writing for All in the Family?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I liked Norman Lear a lot. He liked me. He later hired me as a troubleshooter on his shows for a lot of money a week. But then Arnie Rosen, who was one of his story editors, recommended me. And Norman called me and he says, you know, there aren't many of us. I said, who are us? He said, people that can actually deliver it and make it funny on time when it's called for. I was really pleased. Anyway, I was also pleased that the episode that I wrote is one that has been requested almost as much as the Sammy Davis episode, because mine was about aluminum siding salesman.
I remember it, yeah.
Yes, which is something I did shamefully for part of one summer when I was in college and needed money.
And that's how you got the idea to write
That's
the
how I knew what the pitch was.
You mentioned troubleshooting on shows. Do you remember specific things shows that you worked on for Lear where you were a troubleshooter?
Whatever shows he had going then, I'd rewrite them. He had some pilots going that could never see the light of day, and I would rework those to no avail. One of them I think was called Year at the Top with Mickey Rooney, and the idea was that Satan gives this untalented bunch the ability to become gigantic rock and roll stars, and he'll take their soul at the end. Well, Satan took their soul and the show at the beginning, and it never materialized.
I think Paul Schaefer and Greg Evigan were in that, as I recall.
They were.
Talked to
You're
Paul Schaefer
right.
about it, yeah.
Yep.
What about Barney Miller? You wrote an early episode of that.
I wrote two, I think. One was called Snow Job or something like that.
Did you? Yes, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Did you realize at the time how successful the show would become?
Yeah, and it always amazed me, because on any other network it would have been canceled, but ABC was the network that went urban, which meant people of color, because it wasn't competing at any meaningful level with CBS or NBC. So they did the urban show, and they also did shows that would have been canceled because of low numbers on CBS or NBC. The Odd Couple was one of them. Fortunately, that played on. But Barney Miller was successful immediately, and to me it looked like a pinochle gathering at some Jewish old folks' home, except for Jack Sue, who was the Jewish Oriental, and they called him the Oriente anyway. But it was a good bunch of guys, and Danny was great to have lunch with.
Danny Arnold, right?
Danny Arnold was great to have lunch with. He was a brilliantly talented guy. But Danny was the kind of guy with, if he didn't do it, it was flawed. You know, if he ever needed surgery, I could see him. Don't give me anything to knock me out. I have to make sure, don't use that knife. What are you trying to do? Don't use a knife, use a fork. He was that kind of guy. So it was always murderous to work for him, but great to have lunch with him.
But typically the showrunner or show creators you would work for, it sounded like you got along with most of them.
99% of the time, they were thrilled to have me, and I was thrilled to be in their company. It was great.
How did you become involved with Chico and the Man?
Involved makes it sound like we were planning a heist. But again, I was hot in the business. Every show, I immediately liked Freddie Prinze, and he liked me. And I forget what the first show I did was, but Freddie called me, got my number to call me. He said, "That's the best fucking show, the best one, man. I want you to do all the shows." I said, "Well, that's not going to happen." He said, No, go on. I want to. So he would tell Mike Morris, who was a story editor, "I want this kind of show." And Mike would say to me, "Freddie wants to do the first act. He says nothing. It's all Jack, who played the guy who owned the garage. Second act, Jack Albertson. Second act, Freddie does everything." I said, "Okay." So I wrote that show where Freddie's in the hospital, or Jack is in the hospital, and one of them just talks because the other guy can't talk. Anyway, it got a lot of attention. And I had fun doing that. My Spanish.
Were you staff writer for that?
No.
Okay.
No, I don't think if there was a staff, if I'd have been offered it, I wouldn't take it. Because there were too many drugs on the show, which meant too many late nights and too many frostbitten noses coming out of the toilet with, "I just got a great fucking idea. We're going to set this in France in the 5th century, and everybody's going to say their lines while eating watermelons." Great. Why didn't I think of that?
So the drugs went beyond just the star. It was.
There were a lot of shows in the 70s. There was always a drug problem, or there could have been. With Freddie, it got out of hand, and I hated to watch him kill himself. He was just a great kid.
Was it something that was gradual, or did you notice it from the beginning?
I saw it happen at the start, and when I saw him getting into it in a big way, and offering me some, I said, "Freddie, I don't want to do that. I won't be the same guy. I won't be as lovable. I won't be as short, you know." And I said, "You should cut it out too. You don't need it. You got a great." And anyway, that's when I spoke to the network. Well,
how did the network respond?
They said, "That's not my concern. It's well in hand. You know, drugs are a fact of life, and there's no morality clause that we're invoking. The show's a hit. He knows his lines."
Let's talk a little bit about James Comack. How was he to work with?
Jimmy loved me, and I loved working with Jimmy. As if somebody loves me, I find it difficult not to like them. I wish Jimmy had been a hell of a lot stricter with Freddie. I don't know if Jimmy was using it or not, but I mean, I hated to see that. I don't like to work around drugs, and I don't like to work around drunks. And most professionals, even the old line people, never. You can't do that. You can't work with a hophead. That's not what we're here for. This isn't about being high. So when Robin was doing it, again, I warned him, and he just laughed. And I met him with Jonathan. And of course, I was okay because I was Jonathan's guy. And I wish I'd spent more time with Robin, but...
on the positive side, talk about the chemistry between Freddie Prinze and Jack Albertson. How did they work together? Yeah.
It was lovely because there was real respect. Jack was a consummate professional. I mean, he'd been in vaudeville, he'd done tab shows. He'd been on, tab show is like you steal pieces of shows at work and you put it all together and pretend it's new and yours. And, he'd done everything. And he understood. And he was a guy who'd say, "How do we sell this? We're not selling this." Jack would say that. Anyway, he loved Freddie, and I spoke to Jack occasionally, and Jack always said, "Kid's going to kill himself. Kid's going to kill himself." He says, "I told him." He said, "I told him about John Barrymore Jr., what a great talent he was." He said, "I watched him put himself away." He said, "It didn't do any good."
So when you heard the news of Freddie's death, you weren't surprised?
I was angry.
Angry, yeah.
What a waste.
You wrote, I guess, one episode after Prince passed away.
Yeah.
And were you still on the set? What was the atmosphere like? Was it difficult? Was it?
It was difficult because Freddie was the money.
Yeah.
There was no way to replace Freddie. He was brilliant. He really was. Great actor, great dancer, great musician, a real artist.
What do you think is the legacy of that show?
Well, I hope what it is it makes people who have Spanish as their first language to be considered as American as anybody else. It's funny how the Italians came to New York after the Irish. The Irish were there first, and of course the Irish were considered scum. Then the Italians came, they were scum. And in fact, I'm old enough to remember when Joe DiMaggio would be written about and said, well, he's really like an American. He doesn't smell of olive oil. I mean, come on. Who's going to smell olive oil in the outfield? You know, but that was it. There was still this insular American where any new wave of immigrants was shitty by comparison. So somehow Spanish-speaking immigrants, who are not all from Mexico, and this is something that anybody who's from any Spanish-speaking country gets pissed off about. You know, I'm from Ecuador. I'm not from fucking Mexico. I'm from Puerto Rico. I'm from Cuba. I'm not from, you know, and it's all different. The language is the same. Just like regional dialects with America. Nobody considers people from the South un-American. Well, wait a minute, I do. And when I hear a Southern accent, I always figure that's an asshole. And it usually is. And they talk slow because their mind, you can smell wood burning as they figure out who to blame for the fact that they are not as wealthy as they should be. Anyway, forgive me. My first wife was First Family of Virginia, so I learned what a peckerwood is up close and personal.
You know, as we've said, there were so many half-hour sitcoms. There was Bridget Loves Bernie.
Yeah, I did one of those, sure.
Do you remember the controversy surrounding that one?
Yeah, the idea was a Catholic girl marries a Jewish guy, and there are no suicides, there's no burning at the stake, there's not an excommunication from on high. A priest doesn't come in to molest the rabbi. I mean, what are you doing here? It got a lot of flack, which is ridiculous.
Yeah, and the fact that it made it to the air is a small example of, you know, a little bit of progress.
Somebody having a modicum of courage.
That's right.
And getting hit in the head for it.
And one show I remember that you might not even remember was, it was a Saturday morning live action show with Herb Edelman and Robbie Rist called Big John, Little John. Do you
I wrote that because Sherwood Schwartz produced it.
Right.
Anytime Sherwood did a show, he hired me. So I wrote a couple episodes of Big John, Little John, which I didn't remember until you mentioned it. And Herbie Edelman was a great actor, just great. And he was one of the stars of a movie for CBS that I wrote, starring Bob Newhart, called Marathon. And it was a ripoff of the French movie Pardon Mon Affaire. And Herbie was one of the guys that ran with Bob. And Herbie was also one of the people that appeared in a reading of my play, which is called A Place in the Land. And the story of the play is two old Jews have bought land for a cemetery for their congregation. And the people that sold it to them can get more money selling the land to a shopping center. So they changed the zoning. And it can only be a cemetery till Tuesday midnight. So what these two old guys do is they got to get a stiff and bury it before midnight to make sure the land is a cemetery. Where do you get a stiff? They go to the morgue. Anyway, it still is funny, and Herb was great.
On that note, we're going to take a little break, and we'll
Good,
be right
I will
back.
try to invent some more story.